If you have ever been told your money buys less than it used to, you already understand the oldest financial story there is. Rome told it first, and Rome told it in metal. Here is the number. Under Augustus, the Roman silver coin was struck at about 95% silver. 2.5 centuries later, the same coin held 5% or less. Nobody announced that. No decree, no speech, no moment where an emperor stood up and said, "From today, your money is thinner than it was yesterday." It happened one small cut at a time, each step small enough that the person holding the coin could not feel it. By the end, the coin was silver in name only, and Rome was threatening to execute people over the price of bread. In the next half hour, you will watch that happen cut by cut with the real percentages and the real years. And you will see the exact point where the trick stopped working. Because it does stop working. Start with what the coin actually was, because the physical object explains most of what follows. The denarius was a small silver disc, roughly the width of a modern fingernail, and for centuries it was simply what the word money meant. It was not backed by anything, and it did not need to be. The backing was the metal in your hand. You could weigh it, scratch it, melt it down. Its value and its substance were the same single object. That is a profoundly different arrangement from the money you use today, and the difference drives everything that comes next. A promise can be quietly broken, and nobody sees it happen. A weight, in principle, cannot, which is exactly what makes the story worth 30 minutes of your time. Rome found a way to break a weight quietly, and then ran that method for 2.5 centuries before it finally came apart. Under Augustus, the first emperor, the denarius was struck at somewhere between 95 and 98% silver. That is near enough to pure that the remaining gap is a question of ancient refining technique, not of policy. And that coin traveled enormously well. It paid soldiers on the Rhine frontier, bought grain in Egypt, settled debts in Syria. A merchant in one province could accept a coin struck in another and never think twice about it. Think about how much that trust is actually worth. It is the thing that allows a market to exist at all. The shared, unspoken confidence that the disc in your hand will still be accepted by a total stranger tomorrow morning. Rome had built that confidence, and it had taken generations to build. What follows is the story of what happened when the Roman state discovered it could quietly borrow against that trust without anyone appearing to notice. The pressure came from exactly where this kind of pressure always comes from, in every century and every currency. The empire spent more than it collected, and it did so year after year without interruption. The single largest recurring cost was the army, not a particular war. The standing army itself, sitting in its forts along the frontiers, being paid on schedule whether or not anything at all happened that year. And a Roman emperor facing that bill had only so many moves available. Raise taxes, which is visible and makes enemies. Conquer somebody wealthy, which is expensive and might fail. Or somehow find more coins than you currently have. But there is a fourth move, and it is the one this episode is about. Do not go looking for more silver at all. Simply put less silver into each coin and strike more coins out of the same bar of metal. The purchasing power has to come from somewhere, though. If the new coin buys the same loaf of bread while containing less metal, then the difference has been taken from whoever is holding coins. Quietly and without their agreement. That is the entire mechanism, and it never changes. Everything from this point forward is simply a long, expensive discovery of how far that mechanism can be pushed before the people holding the coins work out what is happening. Nobody in Rome called it debasement at the time. There was no vocabulary for it, no theory of it, no economist to write the pamphlet, which is a large part of the reason it worked for as long as it did. The first emperor to take a serious bite out of the coin was Nero, and the year was 64. That date is the hinge this entire series of episodes turns on. Nero is remembered by most people for other things entirely. In the history of money, he is remembered for one thing only. He is the man who cut the coin first and discovered that nothing bad happened to him for doing it. The silver content came down from the mid-90s to roughly 90%, with the metal cut using copper. The weight came down at the same time to about 3.41 grams. read those two numbers again, because their smallness is the whole point. A cut of 5 or 6 percentage points. A reduction in weight, you would need a genuinely good set of scales to detect it all. If you had been a Roman in the year 65, holding a newly minted denarius in one hand and an older one in the other, you would have noticed precisely nothing. Same size, same face, same weight to the touch, same name. And that is exactly why it worked. The size of the cut was calibrated, deliberately or not, to sit below the threshold at which the person paying for it could possibly detect it. The silver that came out of those coins did not vanish into the air. It stayed at the mint. From the same fixed quantity of bullion, Rome could now strike a meaningfully larger number of coins. More coins out of the same bar, spending in the market exactly as though they were the old coins. That is the trick in its entirety, and it is recognizably the same trick that every currency on Earth has run in the 18th century since. Here's the part that almost everyone misses when this story gets told. In the short run, it works. It does not sort of work, or work on paper. It genuinely works. The soldiers get paid on time, the grain gets bought, the hole in the accounts closes up, nobody riots, nothing visibly breaks, and the following year looks very much like the one before it. And because nothing visibly breaks, the lesson that the next emperor draws from Nero's reform is not that it was dangerous. The lesson he draws is that it was easy, and that it is available whenever he needs it. So Nero's cut established something considerably more dangerous than the cut itself. It established the precedent that the coin was an adjustable object rather than a fixed one. Before the year 64, the denarius was a specific weight of silver that happened to carry an emperor's portrait. After 64, it was an emperor's portrait that happened to carry some quantity of silver. Nothing whatsoever about the coin looked different. Everything about what the coin fundamentally was had changed, and it had changed permanently. And once a thing has become adjustable, the only remaining question is who adjusts it next, in which direction, and by how much. That question took the next 200 years to answer in full. The answer, when it finally arrived, was almost every emperor in the same direction, by a very great deal indeed. Follow the numbers from here, because the numbers are the story, and for an ancient economy, they are unusually clean and unusually well attested. Under Trajan, around the year 107, the silver came down again, to roughly 80%, with the weight dropping to about 3.21 grams. Another 10 percentage points gone. That is 40 years after Nero. Still nothing that any ordinary person could weigh in their hand. Still nothing that would make a merchant refuse the coin or price it differently. Notice the rhythm of it, because the rhythm matters more than any single reign. This is not a collapse. It is a slope. Each emperor inherits a slightly worse coin, takes a little more, and hands on a slightly worse one still. Under Marcus Aurelius, whose reign began in 161, the weight actually held steady at around 3.21 grams, while the silver content fell further, to about 70%. That particular detail deserves a pause, because it is the most elegant piece of the whole deception. The weight held. Only what was inside the weight moved. Which means the coin in your hand felt completely identical to the one your father had used. The same heft, the same size, the same everything a person could actually test without access to a laboratory. The only reliable way to know would have been to melt the coin down and assay the metal. And nobody melts down their own money in order to check whether their money is real. The cost of finding out was higher than the loss. By the end of Commodus's reign, which ran until the year 192, the coin had reached a low point of roughly 71% silver. So take stock. A century and a quarter after Nero's first cut, the denarius had traveled from the mid-90s down to the low 70s. Something close to a quarter of the silver had simply been removed. And still, and this really is the remarkable part, the coin circulated normally. It was accepted across the empire. It bought things at prices people regarded as ordinary. Because money has never been only metal. Money is also habit. And habit is a genuinely powerful economic force. People take the coin because other people take the coin, and that is sufficient for a very long time. That habit turns out to be enormously durable. It will absorb an astonishing amount of quiet extraction before anything at all appears to go wrong on the surface. But it is not infinite, and everything after this point in the episode is the story of the Roman state slowly, blindly locating the edge of it. The edge, when it finally arrived, did not arrive as a shortage of silver in the ground. It arrived as arithmetic that stopped adding up in public. Because there is a floor underneath this trick, and Rome had been walking steadily towards it for 150 years without ever being able to see it. The floor is the exact moment when ordinary people start pricing the coin according to what it actually is, rather than according to what it says on its face. And that is not a monetary event at all. That is a psychological one. Monetary events arrive on slopes. Psychological events do not. They arrive all at once, but the reign of Septimius Severus began in the year 193, and it began the way most Roman reigns of this period began, with an army behind him and an enormous bill in front of him. Under Severus, and then under his son Caracalla, the denarius fell to somewhere between 40 and 50% silver, at a weight of a little over 3 grams. Stop for a moment and take in what that actually means. The coin was now, at absolute best, half silver. The other half was copper, wearing a silver face and an emperor's name. This is no longer a shave taken off the edges of something. This is a fundamentally different object being circulated under an old and trusted name. And at this level of debasement, something changes that had never changed before through all the reigns we have just walked through. The cut becomes visible to the naked eye. Not in the weight. The weight was still approximately correct, and that had always been the giveaway they were careful to protect. It became visible in the color and in the wear. A coin that is half copper does not stay silver-colored for very long. It is given a surface treatment so that it leaves the mint looking bright and convincing. Then it goes into a purse, and into a hand, and into another hand. And it wears. The bright silvered surface rubs away first at the high points of the design, the emperor's cheekbone, the curve of a shoulder, the raised edge of a letter. Underneath, the copper begins to show through, reddish, unmistakable, and sitting directly on the face of the man whose portrait is supposed to be the guarantee that the coin is what it claims. That is the moment this story turns over. For 2 centuries, the debasement had been a fact that only a metallurgist could have established. Now it was a fact that any person could see on the coin in ordinary daylight. Think about what that does inside a market. Not to an economist writing about it 17 centuries later, to a trader standing in a stall with goods to sell and a family to feed. That trader does not need a theory of money and never had one. The trader only needs to notice that the bright new coins go copper-colored faster than the older ones do. And once a single trader notices, the response is immediate and completely rational. Price the old coin and the new coin differently and take the old one gratefully. That is the precise point at which the state has lost control of the thing it thought it was manipulating. Rome could still decide what the coin said on its face. Rome could no longer decide what the market actually believed about it. For the whole remainder of this story, those 2 numbers move steadily further apart, and the widening gap between them is where the finances of the Roman Empire go to die. Severus and Caracalla had one further idea for closing that gap. It was, without much competition, the worst one anybody had yet had. In the early part of the year 215, Caracalla introduced an entirely new coin. Modern collectors call it the antoninianus, after his formal imperial name. Its official, declared value was 2 denarii. Its actual silver content was roughly 1.5 times that of a single denarius. Read that once more, slowly, because everything that follows falls out of it. A coin declared by the state to be worth 2, containing the metal of about 1.5. The state was no longer quietly shaving the coin. The state was now writing a number on the coin that the coin visibly could not support and instructing the market to accept the number anyway. The first antoniniani were struck at an alloy of around 49.5% silver. In a world where the denarius itself was already down near half silver, that on its own was not scandalous. What was scandalous was the arithmetic sitting on top of it. Every single time somebody accepted 1 antoninianus in place of 2 denarii, they handed the imperial treasury the difference for nothing. The market worked that out with remarkable speed, and the market's response is one of the most reliably, predictably human things in the whole of economic history. People kept the good coins. That is it. That is the entire response, and it required no coordination whatsoever. The older, heavier, purer denarii went into jars, into wall cavities, under floors, and into the ground. They stopped moving through the economy. They stopped being money and quietly became savings. And what circulated instead, what you were actually handed at a market stall, was the new thin official coin. The bad money did not defeat the good money in some contest. The good money simply withdrew from the field. At the same time, prices began climbing against the new coin. Buyers and sellers alike understood that it was worth less than it claimed to be, and they both adjusted their expectations accordingly. Which produces the outcome the Treasury never expects and never plans for. The new coin does not buy 2 denarii worth of goods. It buys roughly what its metal is worth, and often somewhat less, because doubt is now attached to it as well. So the state gains on the very first transaction and then loses on every single transaction after it. Prices rise to close the gap, and the advantage evaporates within a season or two. But the coins have already been issued and cannot be recalled. The prices have already risen and will not come back down, and the deficit that started the entire exercise has not gone anywhere at all. So what does the next emperor do? Standing in front of that same unpaid army, precisely the same thing again, only harder and faster than his predecessor did. That is the trap, and Rome had walked directly into the middle of it. From this point, the story stops being a gentle slope and starts being a fall. Because once a market has begun pricing your money by its metal rather than by its face, the only way to raise the same real revenue is to debase faster than people can reprice. And nobody has ever won that race. Not one government in any century, on any continent, in the entire recorded history of money. Now the numbers stop being gradual, and they stop being subtle, and the last 200 years of careful and visible shaving becomes irrelevant almost overnight. Early in the reign of Gordian III, the double denarius was still running at around 48% pure, and it was still being carefully and competently struck. That is the last piece of good news in this episode. Then comes what historians call the 3rd century crisis, the stretch running from the death of Alexander Severus in the year 235 to Diocletian taking power in 284. 50 years. Emperor after emperor after emperor, most of them arriving by violence and departing the same way. Each one needing to pay an army immediately on arrival in hard coin or else not surviving the month. There is no time in a situation like that for tax reform, for land surveys, for building and administration. There is only the mint, and the mint can act tonight. By the reign of Gallienus, which ran from 253 to 268, the coin contained 5% silver or less. 5%, down from 95. Within the lifetime of a long-lived person's grandparents. And it did not stop there. By the early 270s, the coin held under 2% silver, and it was being struck haphazardly, carelessly, badly, because careful striking was no longer remotely the point. At 2%, the object sitting in a Roman hand was a copper token with a whisper of silver somewhere in the alloy. Everybody knew it. There was nothing left to fail to notice. This is what the end of the trick genuinely looks like, and it is worth being precise about it. Not a dramatic single collapse, a coin that everybody continues to handle every day and nobody actually believes in. In the year 274, the Emperor Aurelian reformed the antoninianus. It is worth being very precise about what that reform actually did, because the word reform is doing a lot of work. It did not restore the silver. It set the antoninianus back into a sensible, honest ratio against the denarius. It fixed the arithmetic. It did not fix the metal, because the metal could not be fixed. Which tells you exactly where things stood by then. The most useful thing an intelligent, competent emperor could do about the currency was to make the official accounting honest about how bad the coinage already was. By this stage, the empire had a currency that circulated on compulsion rather than on confidence, and the state itself began to behave accordingly, which is the detail that really settles the argument. taxes were increasingly assessed and collected in kind, in grain, in goods, in labor, in things, not in coin. That is the true measure of a monetary failure, and it is far more telling than any number written in a chronicle. It is the state quietly deciding that it would rather be paid in wheat than in its own money. When the treasury stops trusting the treasury's coins, the argument about whether the currency has failed is comprehensively over. And the next emperor who tried seriously to fix any of this did not go after the coin at all. He went after the prices instead. In the year 301, the Emperor Diocletian issued what has come down to us as the Edict on Maximum Prices. The underlying idea was extremely simple, and it is an idea that has never once gone out of fashion in the 17th century since. If prices are too high, then make charging high prices illegal. The edict set legal ceilings on more than 1,400 separate goods, services, and wages. Grain, meat, wine, shoes, the daily wage of a carpenter, the fee charged by a teacher. It is extraordinarily detailed, and reading it today is one of the best surviving snapshots we have of what an ancient economy actually consisted of, item by item, trade by trade. The penalty for breaching it was death. Not a fine, not a license withdrawn, not a season in prison. Death. And crucially, it applied to the buyer just as much as to the seller, so that the two parties could not quietly agree between themselves to ignore it. That one detail tells you how desperate the situation had already become. You do not threaten to execute buyers unless you already know perfectly well that buyers are willingly paying above the legal price. And here is what happened next. It failed. The evidence for that failure is unusually strong, and the reason is a lucky accident of climate. Egypt is dry, and dry conditions preserve papyrus, receipts, contracts, private accounts with actual transacted prices written on them. Those papyri show prices continuing to rise after 301. The edict did not stop the inflation, and it did not slow the inflation. It simply coexisted with it while remaining on the books, which is precisely the outcome you would predict. And the reason is not complicated once you say it plainly. A price is not a number that a seller picks out of the air from greed. A price is a piece of information about how much of a real thing a given coin will actually command in the world. The edict made the information illegal. It did nothing whatsoever to the underlying thing the information was about. So the goods did what goods always do when a legal price is set below the real one. They left the legal market entirely. They moved into informal trade, into barter, into private arrangements between people who already knew and trusted each other. Or they simply stopped being produced because producing them at the legal price meant taking a guaranteed loss. An emperor could make it a capital crime to charge more than a fixed price for grain. He could not make it a capital crime to have no grain to sell. And that sentence is the ending of the entire 250-year experiment. Rome could decide what the coin said. Rome could decide what a price was legally permitted to be. What Rome could not do was remove the silver from the coin and simultaneously insist that nothing had happened. Those are two different systems of belief, and only one of them was real. The edict usually gets taught as a historical curiosity, the strange emperor who tried to make inflation against the law. It is far better read as the final stage of a very long process. Every step from Nero onward had been a smaller version of exactly the same move. Change the label and hope that the substance quietly follows along behind it. For 2 centuries, the labels held because human habit is strong and slow to break. By 301, the habit was gone, and the only instrument the state had left was the threat of execution. That is not a monetary policy. That is what a monetary policy eventually turns into when nobody involved believes in the money anymore. So what do you actually take away from all of this? Beyond an unusually detailed set of percentages about coins nobody has spent in 1700 years. 3 things, and all 3 of them are usable. They are the reason this episode is worth your time rather than a museum's. The first one, when money is debased, it is never announced, and it is deliberately designed not to be felt. Nero's cut was calibrated precisely so that it could not be detected in an ordinary hand. So the useful question is never, has somebody told me my money is worth less than it was? Nobody is ever going to tell you that. The useful question is, what has stayed exactly the same size while quietly changing what it contains? That question has a very large number of modern applications, and almost none of them involve coins. Package sizes, service tiers, subscription terms, the definition of a working week. The label holds still while the substance moves. The second one. The good money always leaves first, and it always leaves silently, without any announcement or protest at all. The Romans did not organize against the antoninianus. They put their old denarii in a jar and spent the new ones. That is simply what people do, including you and including me, without either of us thinking of it as a decision. Which means the earliest real signal that something is wrong with a currency is not a rise in prices. It is people starting to hold one form of money and to spend a different one. So watch what people around you choose to save in, rather than what they choose to spend in. Saving behavior tells you what people actually believe. Spending behavior only tells you what is currently accepted. The third one, and this is the one genuinely worth carrying out of here. Every single device in this episode worked in the short run. Every one of them, without exception. Nero's cut closed the gap in the accounts. The antoninianus raised real revenue for the treasury. The edict really did hold some prices down, for a while in some places for some goods. All of the failures were delayed. And that delay is exactly what makes this class of decisions so dangerous, because the person who takes the first small step is never the person still standing there when the whole thing stops working. Nero took the benefit. Diocletian inherited the edict and the executions, and an empire being taxed in wheat. 250 years separated the emperor who quietly removed 5% of the silver from the emperor who had to threaten to kill grocers. That is the actual lesson here, and it has very little to do with Rome. There is one more thing about all of this that is genuinely strange, and it is the question that the next episode is built entirely around. Everything you have just watched happened because money was made of a substance, and any substance can be diluted quietly by whoever controls the mint. So somebody, eventually, was always going to ask the obvious question. What if money were made of nothing at all? What if it were simply a piece of paper, and the promise printed on the front of it? That is not a modern idea, and it is not a European one. It happened more than 1,000 years ago in Song Dynasty China, and it worked for a while, and then in a way you are going to recognize immediately from everything you have just heard. Next time on The Story of Money, the world's first banknote, and what happened to the empire that had to find out what money is when it stops being a weight and becomes a promise. If this was useful to you, follow the channel. The series runs in order, and every episode assumes the one before it. Thank you for staying to the end of this one. I will see you in the next.